Here we are at a little school in Greece. You can see the school behind me here. I'm actually not in the classroom. Would you believe I took these photographs nearly 30 years ago now? But I want us to look at this classroom and to think about its architecture. So the first thing is, okay, there's a physical architecture there, which is the walls of the room. And there's a set of spatial arrangements where the children are sitting in particular relationships to each other and the teacher. That's one type of architecture. But behind that are a couple of other types of architecture. One is a communications architecture, which is this sort of frames the patterns of interaction between teacher and students. So it's a, if you like, a kind of a discourse space. The word that Courtney Kasdan used in her famous book from the 1980s, Classroom Discourse, is that learning is framed by these patterns of classroom discourse. But the other kind of architecture is actually a knowledge architecture, a relationship of young people to knowledge and the kind of learning relationships that come through in this kind of a space. So here we are in the classroom. If you look back here, you'll see all the children sitting there at their desks, doing their work, and the desks are bolted to the ground. So there's a set of presuppositions about the way in which students might relate to each other. Now, let's move on to the next picture, and we've now moved to the back of the classroom. We're looking back over the children's shoulders, and we can see the teacher. See the teacher up there sitting on the little stage, and in a way that sort of models this relationship. It's a spatial relationship, it's a discursive relationship, it's an epistemological relationship or a knowledge relationship. There's the teacher sitting up there as a kind of little a font of authority on a little stage, and it's from there that knowledge gets transmitted. So now what we're going to do is we're going to come and look over one of the children's shoulders. So see here, we're looking over this child's shoulder, and the child is using the textbook which has been issued, and all the kids, you know, the kind of metaphorical thing, all the kids are on the same page. They're all looking at chapter 7, which might be about, who knows, you know, ancient history or a piece of reading comprehension or who knows what it is. And there's the child there with their pen and with their in case they make an error, something to their eraser, and they're doing their work. And in a way, it's a process of knowledge absorption. So what's happening is that the child there is reading the book and hopefully remembering some of what's going on. Okay, now we're moving on to look over another child's shoulder. It's a little bit later in the lesson, so here we are looking over this girl's shoulder here, and you can see here she's now taking some notes. And if you want to know my sort of cheeky theory of learning now, see here the girl, she's got a finger there on the book, and what happens is that's the knowledge that she's meant to be absorbing, and it sort of comes up through her finger, through here, ear to ear, down the other side, and she's writing it down, and it's called notes. And it's actually a memory aid. So hopefully on that little journey between that finger and that finger, something sticks. And the proof, of course, that something sticks is when she gets to the test, she will have remembered it. So essentially, that learner's relationship to new knowledge is essentially around long-term memory. So the fundamental definition of knowledge is what you can remember, long-term memory, be that facts, be it information, be it the meanings of words and concepts, be it theories that can be applied. That's the sort of stuff, and essentially it's about memory work. Okay, now what we're going to do now is we're going to go back and look at the class again, and we can see there we've now moved across to the side of the class, like so. We're looking back across the class, and you can see the children are all doing their work. But see that girl in the front row? If you're the teacher, are you worried a little bit at the moment by what that girl's doing? I mean, just think you're up on the stage, you're the teacher, and you're looking down on the class. What do you interpret that girl's bodily movement to mean? So, you know, don't forget we're thinking about this as a space, and in space there are these little micro movements which are bodily movements, which are gestural movements, things that you do. And the teacher is up there on a stage because they're in a kind of a surveillance relationship. They can see everybody, they can make eye contact with them all, they can see what they're doing. So if you're the teacher now, what do you think you might be, how do you think you might be interpreting that girl's very subtle gestural movement compared to the other children around her? Okay, we'll go on to now the next image in my sequence of pictures, and look here, something terrible's happened, because none of the architecture of this space was designed for that. Neither the physical architecture of the room, the way the desks are laid out, nor the communications architecture. So in other words, the students are arranged the way they are in order to hear the teacher speak and to speak back to the teacher when asked. You know, put your hand up one at a time, one person speaks at a time, that kind of routine. But it's not actually designed for this kind of lateral communication. Something terrible's happened here in that spatial arrangement and that discursive arrangement has been disrupted. But there's also nothing in the epistemic arrangement, which is the arrangement around the nature of knowledge, which was designed that way. You know, the textbook had some questions at the end, you took the notes. There was no design in there around peer-to-peer interaction. So the reason why I've shown this is not because we don't know what these classrooms are like. We know what they're like. You know, we've been into many of those things ourselves. And in fact, when we go into a lecture theatre now and hear somebody famous come along and speak, it's the same relationship where maybe, if you're lucky at the end, it's question and answer and one person asks a question at a time. So that's the kind of canonical relationship around knowledge which we would call didactic pedagogy, transmission pedagogy and whatever. And I'm really putting it here not, you know, just because I want these tools to analyse the way in which we might create new and different kinds of learning relationships in e-learning environments, in these new media environments. So that's the purpose really of working through these images. So here we have a space where at the centre of the universe is the teacher, and the teacher is, if you like, doing a couple of forms of distribution of knowledge. They might do little speeches followed by question and answer to clarify that the students have learnt what they're being told, or they might simply hand out the textbook. In other words, they become a kind of a conduit for this knowledge transmission process. So one of the critical things about this space is firstly the central point of the teacher as the person who's the source of authoritative knowledge. But the second thing is there is only one authoritative text, if you like, and that's the text that's in the textbook, which summarises the truth of the world in a chapter relevant to a particular age of student. But also the voice of the teacher as the knowledge authority. So that's the kind of model that we have here. So what happens is the teacher talks and the students listen. The teacher asks a question, and when the teacher asks a question, only one student at a time can answer. It's just, you know, more than that is not practicable. So that's the kind of discursive relationships that are established. The teacher says, read chapter 7, take notes on chapter 7, do the test on chapter 7. So the teacher then orchestrates this kind of process with the textbook at the centre. And then finally at the end of the process, we check what's happened with long-term memory via a test. So if you like, that's a simplified version of this model. And don't forget there are those three layers, the physical architectural layer, which is the desks in the room. By the way, at a very delicate level, that includes human gestures in that space. There's the communications architecture around discourse patterns, and then there's the epistemic architecture around knowledge transmission and memory work. So they're the three dimensions of this space. Now, in the next diagram, what I want to show is what's different, potentially very different about e-learning spaces. Okay, so look, here we have now a kind of a direct counterpoint. The purpose of this is really to ask the question, how might digitally mediated learning spaces be different from the traditional classroom? But that's the kind of the technical question, if you like. So they're different in the sense that they build different discourse patterns, which is that layer, different epistemic patterns, which is that layer, and it's a different physical set of arrangements too, in that the classroom walls are no longer quite what they were and quite as important as they were, or they get reconfigured in a whole lot of interesting kinds of ways. So here we are now. We're trying to think about how might things be different in these kinds of environments. And you can see here what we've done with this diagram, and we've deliberately put the teacher at the centre of it again. I mean, teachers are going to be incredibly important. The kind of fantasy that there'll be self-guided learning and you don't need teachers anymore, it's not true. It's just that the role of the teacher changes in some really profound ways. So let's say, for instance, we've got these environments where we can structure peer-to-peer interaction. So peer-to-peer interaction in a conventional oral interaction framework is actually, it's just noisy. And that might be a good thing. It's busy, it's noisy, it's sometimes chaotic, it's hard to manage. Now, it's a good thing to do. Good teachers do it all along, and they have in fact been doing it since the beginning of progressivism. They've been doing it since Maria Montessori and John Dewey over a century ago said this was a good idea. And in fact, even a couple of centuries ago, Rousseau said it wasn't a bad idea either. So anyhow, this kind of thing, it's really not new. But one of the interesting things about peer-to-peer environments is that you can have a lot of intense interaction happening simultaneously between students. Okay, what's the role of the teacher? The role of the teacher is to scaffold that. So, for example, let me give you some examples of those peer-to-peer interactions. One might be a formal peer review process where students do a draft of their work, they're actively building knowledge themselves, and they review each other's work, they give each other feedback. Well, the teacher needs to build the scaffolds for feedback. It's not just unstructured commenting and unstructured interaction. What constitutes constructive feedback? How can you be helpful with your peers and work in a collaborative environment? That's something where the teacher is still incredibly important, but rather than transmitting knowledge, they're building discursive relationships between peers. That's a very big shift, and in a way it's an interesting, exciting shift for the teacher, in the sense that it really means that they are deeply involved in pedagogical design work and deeply involved in the business of coordinating peer-to-peer interactions. So that's one thing. Another thing is, how might we replace the classic, hands up, give me an answer kind of routine, where only one student in that didactic traditional classroom could answer that question at a time. And usually, if you remember, it was trying to guess what the teacher thought the right answer was. It wasn't as if we could have a serious discussion about it. It was trying to think, okay, what does the teacher mean the right answer to be? So it's actually trying to guess what's in the teacher's head. Okay. Let's say we're in an environment which is a Twitter-esque environment, where the teacher might even orally bring up a topic, or they might bring it by making a post, and then the students all comment. Well, they're all commenting at once, and they all see their comments at once. In terms of cognitive load, it's actually putting more of a cognitive load on the students, and that's a good thing, because in fact just sitting and listening to somebody else answering a question doesn't put a lot of cognitive load, and it's often, particularly for the generation of students that we have, that's often a boring and problematic experience. So in other words, to intensify that load, not take it to beyond breaking point, but to intensify it, is actually a very good thing. It means that every student is answering the question simultaneously, and they're all seeing each other's answers. So that kind of, now that happens in wiki-like environments, it happens in blog-like environments where it's post-comment, that kind of dialectic, and it also happens in Twitter-like environments. So if the teacher builds that kind of environment, it's a very, very, very different set of discourse patterns to the historical ones. So if you like, what we have in this environment is a whole set of profound architectural shifts, but also there's shifts, so architectural shifts around discourse patterns, architectural shifts around these physical objects which are called computers, computer-mediated learning, but also they're epistemological shifts, because you're actually requiring students more and more to be knowledge producers rather than just knowledge consumers. So if you like, this gives you a bit of a sense, if you like, of some of the paradigmatic possibilities in that direct contrast between the architectural models of the didactic classroom and the architectural models of what we would call transformative pedagogy or new learning.